Hello again and happy late Thursday evening local time from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. My sad duty is to inform you that one of the greatest French politicians and statesmen of the 20th century and one of the minor French politicians and statesmen of the early 21st century has passed away. Yesterday, on December the 2nd, 2020, at the age of 94, a former longest-lived French de l'administration, or the National School of Administration. He specialized in finances. In 1956, he was elected to the Chamber of Deputies, which was the French Parliament's lower house during the Third and Fourth French Republics, and he held his seat until 1958. Then he served as a Secretary of Finances, in other words, a junior ranking ministerial position, from 1959 to 1962 in the French government, while General Charles de Gaulle was, and he founded the Independent Republican Party, a centrist party. He was instrumental in defeating President de Gaulle's unnecessary referendum proposal, which actually was an attempt by President de Gaulle to regain his authority after the mass demonstrations and student strikes of the spring of 1968. So during the referendum campaign in March and April 1969, he emphasized his continued support for President and General Charles de Gaulle, but he considered, and rightly so, the referendum totally unnecessary and a waste of taxpayers' money. And as he had promised, President de Gaulle then resigned after a majority of the participating French voters turned down his superficial constitutional reform proposals of decentralizing the French political system to the benefit of regional and municipal governments, and of making the French Parliament's upper house, the Senate, also partly representative of socio-economic or economic groups. During the presidency of de Gaulle's successor, Georges Pompidou, he served as Minister of Finance in the governments of Jacques Chaban-Delmas and Pierre Messet. After Pompidou died of Waldenström's disease, a rare form of leukemia, in April 1974, he quickly announced his presidential candidacy. During the first round's campaign, he was able to surpass Chaban-Delmas, who by then was out of office as prime minister, and then largely as a result of his image of being a dynamic and sufficiently centrist and moderate, but still bourgeois, non-socialist politician and a financial expert, he was able to very narrowly defeat François Mitterrand on the second round of voting in May 1974 with only 50.8% of the vote. Out of over 26 million votes cast, he was only able to defeat Mr. Mitterrand by about 400,000 votes. During the second of the two televised presidential debates, he memorably said, "Vous n'avez pas, Monsieur Mitterrand, le monopole du cœur," or "You don't have, Mr. Mitterrand, the monopoly of the heart," meaning that, in his opinion, it was unfair for Mr. Mitterrand, who had long accused during the campaign him of being the candidate of the privileged social classes, of claiming that only he was the compassionate presidential candidate on the second round. He reminded Mitterrand of the fact that he had actually received more votes than Mr. Mitterrand in a working class city. And he also claimed that he had voters who were economically just as modest as Mr. Mitterrand's electors, and he accused Mr. Mitterrand of trying to wound and divide the French people by claiming that only Mr. Mitterrand represented the ordinary French workers. Once in office, he declared that those who wanted economic, political, and social changes would not be disappointed. And at least to some extent, he was able to keep his promises by liberalizing the abortion and divorce laws, by lowering the age of legal adulthood to 18 years, and generally speaking, by pursuing a centrist course without veering too much to the right or to the left. However, he was opposed to the abolition of the death penalty, and a few more French prisoners were executed in private inside their prisons by guillotine during the 7-year term of the late president Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The so-called 30 glorious years, les 30 glorieuses, ended around 1975, so early during his presidency, because the first oil crisis brought, by that time standards, massive unemployment and a high inflation, a combination of the two that was known as stagflation, in other words, stagnant economic growth, almost zero or virtually zero or even slight decline economically, coupled with high inflation. He tried to fight against those conditions, especially under his second prime minister, with whom he got along much better than under the first one, Jacques Chirac, who incidentally was one of his successors, and whose solemn funeral service he still was able to participate in September 2019 at the age of 93. Raymond Barre was the second prime minister during his 7-year term. As an economics professor, Barre focused more on economic than on political and ideological issues. The late President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing strongly favored the European economic and political integration before, during, and after his presidency. During his presidency, he was a close friend of the Socialist of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt. Incidentally, although Giscard d'Estaing knew German, having been born in Germany, in Koblenz, to be more specific, in February 1926, he mostly communicated in English with the late Federal Chancellor Schmidt. They even had a meeting in, I think, the early 2010s. Both were already old and rather feeble men, especially Schmidt, who passed away at the ripe old age of 96 in November 2015. Anyway, especially during the second half of his presidency, despite the fact that his center-right coalition was able to keep its majority, albeit a weakened one, in the legislative elections of March 1978, he was increasingly criticized because of France's rather stagnant economic growth and for his then rather controversial decisions, and then sometimes perceived lack of ideological consistency by a growing number of left-wing and right-wing French voters. And his first prime minister, Jacques Chirac, who in 1977 had been elected the mayor of Paris, was one of his opponents in the presidential elections of the spring of 1981, which contributed to his defeat. He received 48.2% on the second round of those presidential elections in May 1981, losing to his old opponent, François Mitterrand, who was elected as the first left-wing president of the Fifth French Republic with 51.8% of the vote. 2 days before retiring as president on May the 19th, 1981, he spoke briefly on the French national television, ending his solemn speech with these words: "And during these difficult times when evil roams and strikes around the world, I hope that Providence watches over France for its happiness, for its good, and for its greatness. Goodbye." After pronouncing those words, he stood up from his chair and walked slowly out of the studio. um, After retiring as president in May 1981, he remained politically active until 2004, for example, as a deputy or member of the National Assembly, the French Parliament's lower house, as a member of the European Parliament, as a member of the French Constitutional Council, and as a member of the, I have to look, sorry, Convention on the Future of Europe. He also served as president of the Regional Council of Auvergne, one of France's historical regions, from 1986 to 2004. He joined the French resistance during the German occupation of most of mainland France and participated in the liberation of Paris in August 1944 as an 18-year-old youngster. He then joined the French First Army and served until the end of the war. He was later awarded the Croix de Guerre, or War Cross, for his military service. In 1948, he spent a year in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, where he worked as a teacher at college. He invited the heads of government from West Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and the United States to a summit in Rambouillet to form the group of 6 major economic powers, now G7, including Canada. Economically, Giscard's presidency, despite the rather slow economic growth, saw a steady rise in personal incomes, with the buying power of workers going up by 29% and old age pensioners by 65%. He tried to project a less monarchical image than had been the case for past French presidents, especially Charles de Gaulle. He took a ride on the metro, the Paris Underground or metro train, ate monthly dinners with ordinary Frenchmen, and even invited garbage men from Paris to have breakfast with him in the Élysée Palace, the French president's official residence. However, when he learned that most Frenchmen were somewhat cool to this display of informality, Giscard d'Estaing became so aloof and distant that his opponents frequently attacked him as being too far removed from ordinary citizens. He decided before his death that his funeral would be strictly private, so there will be no state funeral of it, nor any live-streamed version, at least not on the public social media or mass media networks.